can be flawed from its inception. Our panelists highlighted the few documented accounts that showcased a harrowing grassroots level reality, in which people were further marginalized and coerced into a system that was meant to achieve the complete opposite. This conversation was naturally followed by an important address on the interplay of DPIs, big data, and its interaction with digital privacy. From this conversation, we understood that one of the biggest safeguards in the context of DPIs is to embed privacy within its core architecture as a fundamental element of its design. Now, without further ado, it is my honor to introduce the moderator for today's session, Mr. Prashant Sugatan, Legal Director at SFLC.in. Prashant is an engineer turned lawyer with years of practice in the fields of technology, intellectual property, administrative, and constitutional laws. He has worked closely with the free software community in India. He has appeared in many landmark cases before various tribunals, high courts, and the Supreme Court of India. He has also deposed before the parliamentary committees on issues related to the Information Technology Act and net neutrality. Our panel for today's session is comprised of a distinguished set of experts coming from a diverse set of diverse set of professional experiences. Firstly, it is my pleasure to introduce Ms. Desiree Kachenje, investment principal at Co-Develop, where she leads investments in high-impact digital public infrastructure across Africa. With a background in strategy, innovation, and digital financial services, she brings over a decade of experience delivering inclusive, scalable solutions across the continent. Secondly, we have with us Mr. Ashish Aggarwal, Vice President and Head of Government Policy and Engagements at NASSCOM. Since 2018, he has been leading NASSCOM's regulatory and policy engagement with the technology industry, regulators, and the Government of India. He works extensively on policies and legislations relating to digital trade, taxation, data, use of AI, and digital platform governance. Thirdly, we are joined by Mr. Sai Poruri Rahul, CEO of FOSS United. He has spent over 8 years in software consulting and product development, solving scientific computing problems using open source software. A frequent speaker at Python conferences and meetups, he is passionate about building and promoting open source communities. He holds a dual degree, Bachelor of Science and Master of Science in Physics from IIT Madras, and a graduate certificate in public policy from the Takshashila Institute, blending technical expertise with his keen interest in policy and governance. With this, I'd like to invite Prashant to initiate this session with his opening remarks on the topic. Over to you, Prashant.
Thanks, Pranay, for the introductions, and thank you, panelists, for joining the third day of our week-long sessions on DPI. Uh, Definitely, this is an interesting topic, especially when it comes to DPI. See, I mean, recently we find that whatever we do with respect to software and let's say what governments are currently using, governments are increasingly turning to digital public infrastructure to deliver essential services. And the promise of openness, which comes from the open source community and the language, has become a key narrative as far as these projects are concerned. But what does open source truly mean in the context of digital public infrastructure, especially when these are systems which, let's say, citizens interact on a day-to-day basis, and there is also critical information infrastructure involved. What one criticism that we have often heard from the open source community is of open washing, wherein the term open source is used, but often in violation of the kind of meanings, processes that we attach to to these terms by the open source community, by the free software community. So that's what we'll be trying to discuss today. What do we really mean by open source principles when it comes to digital public infrastructure? We'll explore whether the current DPI initiatives live up to the ideals of transparency and inclusivity, and whether the technical and policy processes involved are sufficiently participatory and democratic. Uh, we will have an initial round of discussions. We will have an initial remarks by the panelists, and then we go to questions. Ashish, maybe we'll start with you with your introductory remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, Prashant. I'm sure we are at the third day and probably in the towards the end of this, so a lot of discussion has happened. See, my journey with DPIs started when UPI was being conceptualized at the design stage. That's when, and that was before I started working in NASSCOM. And over that, now it's been since 2016, right? So roughly about a decade. Uh, I think in this journey, what we find is that uh, the DPIs have sort of kind of reached a level where I wouldn't say that they're matured in the country, but we are definitely now have reasonable variety and variety of experiences, and it's useful to think of them as foundational DPIs and then sectoral DPIs, and then probably there is also scope for something which in India we haven't seen. At least I'm not aware. I'm happy to learn, which also happens at a state level. And now, if so, that's one lens, right? That journey. So in that journey, there are one way to look at it is purely from a technological lens, and to what you said, right? So I don't think this is pure open source as open source is defined, and there are probably reasons for this, and we could debate about it, but I think we have a bit of a hybrid approach in India, and probably the intent is to kind of do what is needed in terms of making sure that something is robust, scalable, and all of that. And it is also, so my stress would be not so much on the word open source, but on the word open and public, and that is what should, in some sense, at a higher level, drive the scrutiny of this. And 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 when you think about the concerns, because that's what I think we want to focus on, I think concerns can be many, right? And typically concerns become more important when things succeed and they scale up. And I think we are in that sweet spot to say that we are in that journey, and we were part of the G20 discussions, where now it has become a little more of an international conversation in terms of what do we mean when we are talking about DPIs. And concerns can be many in terms of what we are seeing, not just in terms of access, but it also can be in terms of what can happen in terms of security risk, what can happen in terms of scams to citizens, or what can happen in terms of exclusion. So I think there are many ways we can look at concerns. We can also look at conflict of interest. We can look at IPR issues and all of that. So I think if you then to conclude my opening remarks, there is no single legislative or a national framework which today defines the way the DPIs are conceptualized and then developed and maintained, right? And probably in the initial stage, that probably made sense because you wanted to, you didn't know what you were getting into and you were developing it, and so on and so forth. And now that you have reached that level where you can say that you have all of that proof, it is important for any country to think of developing a cookie cutter which is little more predictable, which is little more in terms of how we think about governance and transparency, how we think of really making sure that they do scale up well, and they are truly non-discriminatory in the sense that we want them to be. So I think that is a point of discussion, and we did, as NASSCOM, thought about that when there was a lot of noise and talk about the Digital India Act, and we thought that that's the right place to house that legislative framework. And in September 2023, we did put out a discussion paper on that, scaling digital governance, where we also talked about DPIs. So I think there is a possibility of thinking about a lot of these issues, and as NASSCOM, I think we are very keen to make sure that the public and the open character of the DPIs is something that is made much more robust and scalable, so that it actually continues to deliver on its promise. So I'll pause here, but happy to come back on specifics.
Yeah. Thanks, Ashish. Definitely, there. I don't think there can be any debate as far as the scale at which these systems have, kind of developed over a period of time. And this, of course, the key aspects that you mentioned should be that these should be robust, secure, that anything that citizens can transact without any fear of their data being exposed, scams happening, etc. So definitely the focus has to be on, the robustness of the software, scalability of the software, and of course security. Yeah. Desire, over to you.
Thank you very much, and I'm happy to be part of this important discussion. I really enjoyed the pre-remarks that were made before me, so I'll just add a little bit more that in the following years after the idea of DPI was shared to the world, most countries, especially in the Africa region, has started to pay attention to what is public infrastructure. And one of the key things that I think would be important to note is that most of these countries already had what we are calling the DPI layers. So they had already started working on identity, already started working on payment platforms, and already started working on data exchange platforms. So what we're seeing now is that now countries are starting to understand a little bit more what DPI approach means. And that means issues around legal frameworks, data protection, safeguards are only coming to them to be built upon platforms that were already there previously. So I think a discussion today, I would like to dig a little bit deeper on how countries are now moving from how they had ideally thought of these platforms and how they're going to build them going forward. And I think the most important thing which we'll see from most countries is that DPI holds incredible potential when we are able to remain with a public bit of DPI. So we can talk about openness and transparency and responsiveness, but really defining what a public good is and how can countries maintain that public good even when they're working on a public-private sector kind of alignment, and how this public good is then able to actually meet some of the safety and inclusion issues that have been raised by different countries. We've seen this in a lot of countries, especially in the Tanzanian region. And for Core Develop, where I work, we are a nonprofit fund that we support the rolling out of digital public infrastructure, but also we support some of the research work and inclusion work to understand how DPI can be built better or can be scaled better. So I'll be happy to share some of the thoughts from what we're seeing, especially for the African region, which is where I'm focused on. Thank you.
Thanks, Nishan. It will be great to listen to points of view from especially the African region, and also the kind of, the legislative frameworks that we should be looking at to ensure that these systems, which are, of course, the end user is the citizen and their services given to citizens, and how we can protect their rights. I mean, that, of course, has to be paramount. Yeah, over to you, Rahul.
Hey folks, nice seeing you again, Prashant. Desiree, Ashish, nice to meet you. I'm a technologist. Again, like my background is in pure sciences, but I've been like working on solving problems using software for the last like 8 to 10 years, and I've I've been seeing the open source movement from a number of different angles, and also seeing some of the conversations around digital public infrastructure and digital public goods and all of these things, especially over the last 3 4 years. I think one of the fundamental challenges or concerns that I have with this ecosystem is like, what do these things mean? I feel like there's a lot of ambiguity in what these things mean. The good thing with DPI is it's very clearly defined. One of the uh, 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 one of the points in its definition is it needs to be open source, and this again, like open source as a word has a very specific meaning. Like free software has a specific meaning. Uh, there are certain things attached to those words, and my fear is these things are as software is becoming more and more common, and as software is touching the lives of more and more people, not just in India but across the world, I'm afraid that we're beginning to see the dilution of some of these words and what they mean. Uh, Language understandably evolves, but we also need to be very clear when, like, when some of the meanings of these things like start getting away from what they originally are and what they were meant to be. And the reason why I'm saying it is there's a lot of existing understanding and capacity that the free and open source software ecosystem around the world has built up in terms of how do you build software over the course of decades with hundreds if not thousands of developers contributing to contributing lines of code to projects, and how do you maintain some of those ecosystems in a meaningful way? How do you maintain these ecosystems in an active way? How do you sustain some of these ecosystems, both from the point of view of the projects being sustainable and still solving the problem that they were supposed to, and also the people who are taking part in the ecosystem as well? And the reason why I'm saying it is there's
That is the way forward. However, having said that, to say that how do we put together a governance framework around it so that this is that, as I said earlier, that it can actually be developed as a cookie cutter, because that's when the true value will happen. Because that's when the true value will happen, both in terms of its scalability and adoption, and that's going to fantastic, if I might use. In some sense, that is something, how better that can be, that process can be instead up, is going to be very important. And also, it's very interesting what Rahul said earlier, that how do we decide which DPI is to be built? Now, again, I think we have come through a journey where on the foundational piece, probably it made sense that okay, these are foundational pieces, it makes sense. But health DPIs, foundational pieces, it makes sense. But health DPIs, probably it also makes sense in terms of what is being done. Then we had the ONDC. So okay, why do you need an ONDC? We think about saying that okay, this DPI makes sense and we want to go ahead with it. Then how do we think of stewardship of that DPI? Who will be doing this? What kind of bylaws that steward should have? So some of these things, I think it is a good time to probably reflect upon and say that can we take the learnings from the past and create something which is more statutory in terms of framework level. We are not talking about prescriptive level, but there are a whole set of laws and entities which can then definitely reference that framework to do the thing which is required. And ultimately, I think we are now as India, we are looking at. Many more countries, collaborating with us on the DPI approach, and it will be interesting to see that how much of this approach can actually be made interoperable at a global level truly. And that's where some of these, both at a level of technology and at a framework design level, these will get tested. Right now, I think there is a lot of intent and a lot of initial talk, but we are yet to see anything which is truly scaled and matured. So I think that journey is still ahead of us, and it will be interesting to understand how those kind of collaborations are happening. I'm happy to understand and learn from my fellow panelists if they have thoughts on that.
Thanks, Ashish. So definitely the statutory and legal frameworks, and especially when it comes to how other countries adopt it and how the kind of experiences that that we can learn from them, and they can learn from our experience. I think that is very important. And Desire, coming out to you, like what Ashish suggested about the kind of regulatory approaches that we need to have, the legal frameworks that we need to have. So, what is it that we can do to ensure that the kind of frameworks, statutes that we have, that are getting developed, that we are discussing, those other to open standards, avoid mental lock-in, and maintain largely public control over this very critical infrastructure?
Thank you very much, and thank you, Ashish. I think every time he speaks, I still a few of his knowledge. So thank you for what you're sharing. So if I'm to give examples, I think there are three ways that we can include legal frameworks to ensure that DPI adheres to open standards, and of course avoids vendor lock-ins, which is one of the key things that I think when we're thinking of an inclusive and a sustainable DPI, avoiding vendor lock-in is one of the key things, especially when you're speaking to regulatory authorities. So one of the things that I would talk about is mandating open standards and interoperability by law. To be honest, if we look at the market, I think a lot of governments or governing institutions have been able to manage the second bit, which is interoperability by law. But when it comes to managing open standard, like Ashish said earlier, there are some very valuable concerns around open standards, especially when it comes to things such as payment or data protection, that becomes difficult to completely mandate it and say that it has to be open. So that place, I think we can do more work around it. But I've seen a couple of examples of countries who are mandating interoperability by law. And when we say interoperability, it means and at least ensuring the key APIs when it comes to DPIs are open, so that there is two platforms can speak to each other. And a lot of use cases that have been built upon DPI platforms have interoperability by law, and it's because regulators discover that the only way that they can bring in private sector and other players and still maintain inclusive DPIs is to insist on interoperability by law. A good example of this is when we look at our payment platforms. A lot of payment platforms now are ensures that governments speak to private sector players, which are usually your banks, your telcos, to have open APIs into the central payment platform. So that's one example that I think a lot of governments have done their best to push for. When it comes to mandating open standards, I think to some degrees countries can think of different ways to adapt to this. But before they get to that stage, I think they need to be able to have legal frameworks around data protection and competition. In that way, when you're saying open standards, there's a clear description on how this open standard looks like, and it's protective to both the end users and to the platform builders, which includes private sector. I think the second thing that we can, sorry about that. I think the second thing that governments can do, and we've seen, is preserving the public ownership. I think I mentioned earlier that when it comes to ensuring that DPI is really meeting the potential that we're hoping, it needs to still remain to be publicly owned. Now, this becomes a little bit difficult when it comes to platforms such as payments. Again, I'm giving payments because payments is the one platform that really brings in a lot of private sector institutions, so that the governance and regulatory around DPI and payments becomes a little bit harder than the other two. Even in ID, now we're seeing that maintaining what we're calling a public ownership works when you're building the foundational ID. But when different private sector entities now takes up this ID to build other use cases, the bit of public ownership is still in concern. So I think one of the things that we should think about and countries are considering right now is how do we ensure that there's a public ownership when it comes to DPI, no matter how much they're involving in use cases that have been built upon. This will help us avoid monopolies and also avoid proprietary capturing, which has been happening prior to the DPI approach. And last but not least is adaptive safeguards that match the evolvingness of DPI. I think this is what I was saying earlier when it comes to mandating open standards. We are seeing newer use cases. We look at new use cases. That means the previous policies and regulations, especially when we're speaking to data, because I think that's a huge bit when it comes to DPI. The countries and regulatory authorities need to be able to evolve with these new use cases. I can give an example here. Currently, SADC, which is the Southern African Development Community, which brings in around 16 countries in the south of Africa, are thinking of how they can create a central ID registration. But to do this, they need to first go back and work out what are the national laws when it comes to data protection in IDs, and how do they create a centrally owned or federated, whatever that works best, ID registry that still adheres to the legal frameworks of all these countries. That is a level on top of the safeguards that will be built within countries. So we're seeing that for DPI to evolve the best way, safeguards is not something that is, it's almost like a living thing that needs to consistently be upgraded and adaptive, so that when we're creating newer use cases, these use cases adhere to some of the innovation that is happening. And I think the second bit is also anti-competitive practices. One of the things when we talk about DPI, and most of DPIs, when we're saying we want it to be built with DPGs, or we want it to be built with open APIs and open standards, the element of competition becomes very important, not only to builders, so the private sector, but also to citizens and users. So descriptions around how countries can create legal frameworks that mandate safe and inclusive competitive markets would be important going forward. We are yet to see countries that have done this well, but if we look at a lot of CSOs that are working within the DPI space, this is some of the discussion that they're bringing up. And I think as we involve the DPIs in the use cases, we will see better ways that countries can think about competition when we are talking about open markets. Yeah, I'll end there, but happy to take any questions or additions from my fellow panelists.
Thanks, Lisa. Definitely, laws like data protection, competition, these have to be, I mean, really need to have frameworks that ensure competition, that ensure that the data is protected. So definitely, we need the least legal frameworks in place before we can have extensive use of DPIs. Definitely, that is an important thought, and we'll definitely come back to that in the next stages. And Rahul, over to you. Uh, Rahul, I mean, when we talk about the open source community, one important aspect, the reason why I would say the community has thrived is mainly because of the licenses that have been in use. The various copyright, I mean, copyleft licenses, or or various terms of copyright licenses that have been used by the community, like the GPL, etc., which have been important to ensure that we have an ecosystem that thrives. It's not just that somebody kind of uses the software, but then they can tinker with the software. So, what do you feel about the kind of software which is now being developed as DPI? Do we have these freedoms in place? What about these licenses which are being used?
Yeah, thanks, Prashant. Yeah, Desiree, that was very interesting. You've made a bunch of very interesting points, but your response also prompted me to sort of like take a step back. I I I I'm gonna get to your question, Prashant, but I want to talk about a couple of other things first. Um, I mentioned this in the beginning, and like I just like end up feeling this more strongly like with every passing conversation. I feel like we are reinventing a lot of things over and over and over again. So the internet is digital public infrastructure, right? Like the entirety of the internet and a lot of things that we have been doing are digital public infrastructure, because it's enabling us to interact with what were previously physical entities in entirely new ways through the digital medium, through the internet. uh, the internet itself is governed, and there's no central in the sense of there's no one a single company which is responsible for controlling the internet. There's a number of different bodies, all of which together create the necessary standards on which the internet is built, right? There is the Internet Engineering Task Force, IETF. There's the W3C, which is the World Wide Web Consortium. There's a whole bunch of these sorts of organizations which are made up of like technologists and civic technologists who are able to come together to say, hey, look, how do we talk to one another over the internet? Let's figure out a protocol, and then they've they were able to put together what was like the original version of the HTTP, right, the hypertext transfer protocol. And then with every new challenge that keeps coming up, they were like, yeah, you know what, like we need to modify this so that there's another way of communicating information from a server to somebody who's requesting this information, right? Two servers which wanted to talk to one another, they said, look, you know what, we need better ways for like these servers to be able to talk to one another. And they said, okay, fine, you know what, we'll come up with other mechanisms and APIs and means of communication for like these things. Uh, the internet itself, when I am logging into this call, and when Desiree is logging into this call, and Ashish is logging into this call, all of us are not in the same physical location, and still like we are able to pass our data through a number of different nodes, which are then able to pass it on to some sort of central node, which is where it is then getting like sent across, sent back to everyone else who's watching, and also back to all of us, right? So the internet is federated by design, and it also means that we're able to have a lot of places in the middle where we can intervene and make things better. Cloudflare, for example, is as successful as it is because they were able to say, you know what, why is somebody being asked for the same information over and over again? You don't have to actually go and talk to their servers. I'm going to store this information, and whenever somebody asks you for it, I'm just going to give it to them. You don't have to like do any work, right? So there's a lot of like 20-30 years of work has gone into designing the internet to be as robust as it is, and as consultative as it is. There are a significant number of working groups that exist in the IETF and the W3C, all of them who are trying to constantly work on the internet itself and internet layer applications that are built on top of it, right? These mechanisms happen through RFCs, like requests for comments, where the working groups are set up, they put out requests for comments, which anyone from the entire like world can comment on and say, no, you know what, like this is actually meaningful or not meaningful. At the end of the day, a lot of the use cases are still driven by the corporate sector, right? Like Google comes and says, hey, look, this protocol is outdated. We want to develop a new protocol to be able to talk to one another, etc., etc., and they're able to drive innovation in that way. All of us have like heard about PNG files, right? PNG image files. Uh, there was a new version of the PNG standard which came out like a few months back. And the reason for that again is because as technological innovation keeps happening, there's more and more demands of the existing technologies that we already have. And therefore, you always continue iterating on these standards. The reason why I'm saying all of these things is because I feel like we are trying to build out entirely parallel systems of governance, which are making the same mistakes over and over again, and aren't able to learn from some of these mistakes, and aren't like able to bring in some of these systems of governance into the DPI ecosystems, right? Why don't we have working groups at the federal level which are talking about, hey, what is Aadhaar? How does the Aadhaar ecosystem itself evolve if it is a DPI, right? How does the UPI ecosystem evolve if it is a DPI? What does that working group even mean? What is that RFC? What is the standard, which is what the other standard is? What are these open APIs? And I'll go one step further, right? One of the reasons why open source is as successful as it is because when you do make things open source or you have open APIs, and you very clearly say that, hey, look, I am going to give you an incentive to find issues with my network, right? Facebook, Google, all of these large companies have very significant bug bounty programs. And they pay out a ton of money, tens of thousands of dollars, if you're able to find a significant vulnerability in their systems, right? And it's either fully open source code or it is open APIs and open standards. It's built on top of all of these things, right? And you're able to build these systems of governance on top of open source software, where you're able to say, you know what, there will always be nation state or other actors who want to take advantage of my system for financial gain. But at the same time, there's always good people as well who are able to point out the problems in my system if I'm able to actually make it open. And we would, in my understanding, be able to build much better DPIs if we are fully adopting this collaborative and public design for DPIs, right? Like, why doesn't Aadhaar have a bug bounty program where we are able to say, find issues with the code or find social engineering challenges with the systems designed here, right? A very common concern about Aadhaar is, okay, fine, like the Aadhaar database itself might be unbreachable, but when information is put into the database or being pulled out of the database, there's significant leakage that happens there, right? There's a significant amount of data loss and data breach that happens when the information is being pulled to, let's say, another updating center or something of that sort. So why aren't we able to set up these sorts of systems where we can say find vulnerabilities? There's a very big ecosystem in the country and across the world which is going to be able to find these challenges, right? Which is going to take it either as an educational opportunity or they do it professionally, right? And we are not able to take advantage of some of these systems because, again, like I feel like we are building out an entirely different parallel ecosystem and parallel governance systems. My personal opinion is, like, these things have worked. They've worked for the last 20 years, where people have set up bug bounty programs, discovered significant issues in all of these major organizations, and it's good for the individuals and it's good for the organizations as well and the overall ecosystem if we are actually able to set up some of these sorts of consultative systems, right? The open source system has thrived. Coming back to the original question, Prashant, the open source system has thrived because there are a fundamental set of rules that we are all built on top of. But at the end of the day, the ecosystem has thrived because within those rules, we are able to innovate in terms of, okay, I've drawn a very clear boundary about what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And now I'm able to build systems of collaboration and systems where I am able to point out the issues that exist in somebody else's code and help them improve theirs, and it's either a financial incentive or I'm doing it because it's just for the greater good, right? And yeah, the reason why I'm going into this detail is because, again, like, we're talking about public by design, and the internet is public by design, and I feel like we are not having some of these conversations with the people who have built these governance systems, and having those conversations and trying to pull in some of those governance mechanisms is going to be incredibly valuable for us to ensure that we're building things long term.
Thanks, Rahul. Definitely the kind of processes that we have in place, kind of public participation, and yeah, looking at how the standards are built in, let's say, IETF, W3. I mean, like you specifically talked about RFCs and how these processes by itself are participatory in nature and without any kind of entry barriers, so to speak. And I mean, taking a point from there, Ashish, coming over to DPI and the kind of, let's say, uh, I mean, when you look at the principles and how the building DPIs, like, what is it that the government, what is it that various entities which are involved in this can ensure that these processes are more participatory in nature, so that we have the, let's say, the at least the principles of open source being kind of embedded in this whole program.
Yeah, thanks. So the way, again, I have seen it personally as a journey is that a lot of the time, for example, I'll take the example of the health DPI initiative. One, it's much more complex when we think about it as probably compared to payments. And the number of stakeholders which are involved, you look at hospitals, you look at pharmacies, you look at insurance, you look at the obviously the customer, and so on and so forth. It's and we are really looking at to say that, a lot of standardization of data registries, a lot of mapping of the ecosystem and all of that. It's a lot of work. But when you think about it, before even we thought about the health DPI, there were private entities doing exactly the same thing. So there were the Practos of the world, and there were other people who have built on platforms which kind of were solving for the market. But again, when you think about it at a big picture level, what you're trying to do at the level of a DPI is something which is much bigger, and which is probably going to give a value which is going to be much more significant at scale. And what probably it won't do is to create these multiple competing platforms where stakeholders get locked into the platform because of either the network effects and so on and so forth. So I think what we must recognize is that while internet is the most foundational DPI, as progressively we move into the different DPIs, the complexity and the nature of those DPIs change. And and I don't think there is one right way. There could be a right way where there is no central party. It is entirely working based on protocols and kind of community. Maybe it is possible in some cases. I don't think it is actually possible in all. We also need to then weigh in on the fact that certain DPIs, by their very nature, would be in tightly or highly regulated sectors, and then that would has some of its own constraints or boundaries. But having said all of this, I think if you now sitting in 2025 and with a decade of experience of experimenting with DPIs, we know for sure that the human centric approach to DPI needs a lot more strengthening, and it can be done. So, this example of bug bounty is a great example. So, today in the Indian legal framework, for example, ethical hacking is actually not legally permissible. So, unless it is done in a very closed contractual manner, just public ethical hacking is risky because of the way the legal framework is, and so we need to think about multiple ways of thinking. What are the ways where the incentives are aligned so that DPIs are strengthened by community participation and not because of only a certain set of people who have probably designed that. And I think they're doing a great job. It's an excellent job, but I'm sure that there are ways it can be strengthened. The another interesting thing is that there are actually a lot of these working groups and conversations where a lot of these discussions do happen, and at least as representative of a tech industry body, we know that government reaches out to us regularly to bring in the startups, to bring in the community in terms of who will be able to actually innovate on top of these foundational DPIs to build the solutions. And to that extent, I think we are seeing a stage where today, if you look at the foundational DPIs, the ready stack of identity, payments, and data exchange is actually allowing a lot of innovation to happen much quicker, much faster, and to be able to scale up rapidly. So I think that story is unfolding very successfully. I think the risk of exclusion continues, and this is something it is not just at the level of system design or technology. It is also just in terms of the efficacy or efficiency and the working of the DPI in all the heterogeneous environments that we as India present. And one of the other ideas, for example, which probably could be baked in any DPI is the idea of mystery shopping. It's the oldest idea when we think of saying that how do we come to a very clear understanding of service levels on the ground. But I'm not aware of any DPI which has a structured program of mystery shopping, right? And publish a report as to say that, okay, this is how, I'm sure all of them have some kind of annual reports, but we don't read a lot about that. Another basic idea of governance. So I talked about earlier in terms of stewards, handling the DPIs. At a minimum level, one would think that if it is encoded, I'm sure it is happening, but the point is not about whether it is happening in pockets because of great people who are running this, but because how is it that we are leading up to something which is cookie cutter. That when we think about governance, maybe it would be very intuitive to say that whatever is the governance for a listed private limited company, that level of governance could be the starting point for a governance of a steward for a DPI. But is that something that is standardized across all such institutions? We don't know. Maybe it is. So I think the interesting thing would be to actually now more actively engage in each of these DPIs to say that how wherever there are these gaps, and I think there is a lot of interest in both the government and the institutions who are developing this and the industry which is participating in this to say that okay, we would be very keen to take it to the next level of robustness and scalability and modularity. And I think it is happening, and that's the great thing about it. So I would love to see now, for example, India AI mission when they kind of actually go live and they open up the LLMs which get developed through this mission, how does that get architected in a way that a lot of these DPIs can leverage a lot of the work that comes out of the AI mission to further turbo power our DPIs in a way that can be leveraged by the industry to develop better solutions and products for the market. So I think there is a lot of stuff which is happening, and a lot to go. But overall, I would think that the glass is more than half full.
Thanks, Ash. Thanks, Ashish. Continuing on the governance question, which Ashish highlighted, Desire, if you look at, so what are the kind of institutional or community-based models that can ensure accountability, transparency, and public interest when it comes to long-term evolution of DPI?
Um, thank you. And yes, I think to answer this, I can simply merge what Ashish and Rahul just said and give an answer. But like, so if I start back with what Rahul shared, I completely agree with it. I do agree that distributed governance of the internet has been one of its greatest strengthening and release and resilience, especially when it comes to innovation, from the innovative perspective. But the reality on the ground, especially for lower income countries, if I look at countries or continents such as Africa, digital public infrastructure, it sits in the intersection of how grand and open the internet has been, with like some critical public services like identity, payments, and data. So if we do not find, I guess, a marge or somewhere, a meeting in the middle of the freedom or the distributed governance that the internet had, and also bring together things such as rights, sovereignty, and public interest, we still go back to the same issue around exclusivity, and not bringing in the natural internet governance right away, because there are some areas, especially in some regions, that will still be, to a large extent, not being heard, but also not safeguarded. So I think a balance or a right in the middle approach would really work, which I think is what Ashish was saying. So if I'm to think of models, I think there are two key models that we've seen that work. One of them is establishing a multi-sector governance when it comes to accountability and transparency. So if we look at some of the DPIs that have been rolled out, I will speak again to payments. The reason why I keep saying payments is because in my previous work, I worked for Moduloop, which is a payment platform, and they were trying to build up an inclusive digital payment platform. So I kind of understand some of the governance and the conversations that went behind, payment platforms such as that. So when you establish a multi-stakeholder governance with clear accountability, is you can put up what, or at least in payments, they've tried to put up what they're calling a scheme. So within the scheme, you have private sector, you have auditors, you have taxpayers, you have end users, you have all the different types of digital digital payments stakeholders who come together, and they call this a scheme rule. So then they come up with different schemes on how this particular platform would work. So this becomes very specific to a country, of course, but I've also seen it, expand regionally, that they take the scheme operators of specific countries and they allow them to make decisions to, larger regions or a region as a whole. So for example, if the East Africa community brings together one payment platform, and then they create a scheme that's made up of scheme members of different countries that exist. So what this does is that you find that within the scheme, or within this multi-sector governance, you already naturally have different stakeholders that are looking at different aspects. So you would find that the private sector would naturally look around things like competition, look around end user interest, look around innovation. How are we able to innovate quicker and faster when we're evolving this platform? And then you would find your regulators naturally coming in around policies and asking questions about data protection. You'd find end users speaking about costs of these platforms. How can we make it more affordable for end users, and some of the exclusivity that happens now because of this sort of discussion. When it comes to accountability, it becomes more transparent, because they can now set rules on how is accountability being done, what is the roadmap when you're overseeing this DPI. And also independent audits are also mostly welcomed when you have discussions like this. Example of how in payment systems scheme one example of a multi-stakeholder governance when it comes to building out DPI. I haven't seen this when it comes to data exchange or when it comes to ID, but I think ideally, as we are now seeing new use cases for example, ID, whereby countries are partnering with private sector to find new use for ID, certain scheme operators or scheme rules will be very helpful. And then the other one is open community participation, which I think DPGs have been doing this for a very long time. This is, you just enable public consultants, developers' contributions, and open forums where discussions can be held about particular DPIs. The only issue is now that middle ground, now bringing together. I've seen a lot of this happen from a DPG community. A lot of DPGs do have these open forums, but when this DPG is now used within a country to now create a DPI, I think countries are still on the way to create a sort of open spaces whereby they take some of the feedback that they're getting from developers or getting feedback from users of the code of the platform to send back and allow these platforms to become a little bit better. I think the approach so far has been mostly from CSOs, who most of the time go after governments for specific usages, specific data privacy issues. But I think this could expand more to create more open forums around discussions, and I really think developer contribute what's missing. So like Rahul said earlier, we really need to bring in players that have been in the open market for a long while to actually start making almost like requests or making feedback directly to governments who are now running the DPI platforms. So I think those are the two models that I can speak of right now. So I'll hand over back to you. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Desire. Rahul, you talked about how the internet is being governed. That essentially is the multi-stakeholder approach, where you have persons from the participation from civil society, technical community, the private sector, and the academia. Can we have something similar in the case of what is the kind of things that each of these participants can do when it comes to DPI? What could be the approach that maybe we can adopt?
Perfect. Yeah. Sorry, Desiree, it's very interesting that you bring up Moja Loop. I want to have a small clarification. Moja Loop maintains the standard and it puts out the open source software associated with the standard. It does not maintain the network, right? The network to be able to make the transactions.
Yeah, so there are two things. There is the DPG community that maintains things like code changes, etc. I think they call it design authority, etc. But then within a country, so for example, a country like Rwanda that has adopted Moduloop would then create a scheme within that country, and then this scheme would have Moduloop as a player, a partner, and then you would have other stakeholders within. So those are two different things. Sorry if it sounded the same.
Perfect.
Yeah.
No. I just wanted that clarification because that is something that we are missing in the DPGs that we are putting out, right? So ONDC maintains the standard, but they also operate the network. NPCI maintains the UPI standard, and NPCI also maintains the ONDC network, right? These are two completely different responsibilities, and like you need entirely different skill sets to be able to like build and maintain a standard and to be able to build and operate a network. And I think the very interesting thing with Moja Loop also is you are able to deploy different nodes which are able to make transactions, but then because everything is still using the same standard, you could technically have inter-country transactions happening on the Moja Loop network, right? So why is that missing in UPI right now, right? Like by NPCI, why, whether it's a question of some other country deploying UPI so that we can make inter-country transactions, or it actually shouldn't be NPCI's responsibility to go and deploy the same network on other countries, but rather the other countries could say, yeah, fine, I'm going to deploy the exact same thing, give these benefits to my people, and you know what, I can just like flip a switch and magically connect all of these countries together so that you can make international transactions because everything is using the same network, right? Same network, same standard. That again, the fundamental question goes back to, and again to answer your question, Prashant, two examples of DPGs which I want to give, which are very grassroots and like very close to the problems that they solve are Bamni in the health sector and Pratham Books in the education space. Both of those are recognized DPGs, and both of them have been open source before they were DPGs, right? They were open source because they wanted to solve the problem meaningfully, and they wanted to contribute to the commons, and they wanted to ensure that as many people actually use those solutions as possible. And Bamni is like complete as a software to an extent where I don't remember which country, but if I'm not wrong, the entire country of Nepal or Bangladesh actually deployed Bamni to all of their healthcare ecosystem, right? So again, like these aren't sort of like semi-complete software either that we're like referring to. And there again, like Bamni is a very interesting example because it came out of ThoughtWorks, which is a global leader when it comes to software services industry. But when ThoughtWorks started creating Bamni and they started getting traction for Bamni, they realized that, you know what, we can't create Bamni while also at the same time implement Bamni for the hospitals which want this, or for the countries which want to adopt Bamni, right? ThoughtWorks very clearly said we are not going to be involved here. We do not want to even give a perception that we are both creating the playing field and also playing in the playing field. We can't both be the people who are regulating this project and steering the direction of the project while also being able to do implementation work of these projects. Pratham Books, on the other hand, again, very fundamental, like problem focused, and they were able to build something out to the point where the solution that they built out, it has again been white labeled and it's been deployed to, I don't exactly remember which Southeast Asian country, but some Southeast Asian country adopted it to be able to make educational material accessible to a significant amount of the school population in those countries. The reason why open source software is successful, or like the one of the fundamental defining characteristic to practically all of the open source software, sorry, all of the successful pieces of open source software, like we are using Bitbucket, which is like where we are doing the video call right now. I'm using Firefox, which is an open source browser. Chrome is another very popular browser which is built on top of Chromium. The reason why these things came about were because people were solving one very specific problem, and then they started expanding the scope of that problem. They very clearly solved a significant pain point, and then they started like expanding on top of it. There was a set of like domain experts who were able to say, you know what, like this is a problem that I am able to solve directly, and I'm going to work specifically on this. And then as and when that problem started being solved much more comprehensively is when a larger community started coming around those and then being able to do meaningful things on top of it. And that again is what my answer to your question is, Prashant, in terms of like how can all of these different people be engaged in these things. They can be engaged if these are problems which come bottom up. I feel like there's a hidden link between public infrastructure and digital public infrastructure, which isn't true. Public infrastructure, by its very nature, has to be government owned and government operated. Roads are such a significant expenditure that no other private player could be made responsible for. Okay, you are going to take care of, like, you're responsible for all of it. The government has to be responsible for the roads, for the railways, for the air traffic, and all of these things. Like public infrastructure is very capital intensive. Digital public infrastructure is not. So when we take the same approaches of public infrastructure, it has to be centrally planned, centrally managed, it has to be top down in nature. When we try and translate those things over to digital public infrastructure, it is fundamentally sort of incompatible with the way software itself is built and successful software itself is built, right? Successful software, whether it's open source software or non-open source software, is almost always built from the ground up. You're on the ground solving the exact problem that needs to be solved today, and then as and when that use case starts expanding and you start comprehensively start like solving that problem, is when you're able to say, hey, look, you know what, this is a meaningful enough solution that we can now start deploying this across the board, across the state, across the country, right? And I feel like this is a very unsaid thing when it comes to public infrastructure. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks, Ashish, Design, and Rahul. I mean, if we could have like a closing remarks, one or two sentences. Yeah, if we could. Yeah, we have really run out of time. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, so I think it is fantastic to hear my panelists and I think a lot of the solutions should evolve ground up. I completely second that, and I also feel that to the extent that the role of the state is minimal, it is great. They should only step in when the ecosystem approach is actually required. And I also feel that this point on, interesting point which Rahul made, this basic conflict of interest being operator and setting of the standards, that clear Chinese wall, if I can use that word, is something that is should be sacrosanct. So we should not leave it to the good intent of the people. And I think some of these things, if we can build it on our existing DPI story, then I think whatever we are able to do, we'll be able to achieve 10x in the next decade or so. So that would be my closing thoughts. Thank you.
Okay. Desire.
Yes, thank you, Ashish. Thank you, Rahul. You've made me write down a lot of notes and questions I need to go back to the team and speak about. So I'll just pick up on what we talked about when it comes to NPCI and how you cannot set up a community and then also be the one to look after a network. So I'm looking at it in terms of when you're exporting such a DPG, and I'm saying this because a lot of DPGs that are being considered, especially in the African continent, is to take primarily being set up and developed in a different country. So when there's no a clear distinction between those two, it raises one of the big challenges that we're seeing right now in DPI or in open platforms as a whole, which is sovereignty elements and even end using around how much do we own, control, build, make changes, or create feedback when it comes to platforms that we are building. They are at best locally owned. So I think one is what Rahul just said, to separate those two things. That means when you have a network, that network made up of numbers of people in different countries, in no influence, and also countries feel like there's sovereignty in some of the DPI that's been adapted. And then the second bit around that is also local capacity building. This is something that I think is been spoken about a lot when it comes to DPI, but I still think like we have not coined what we mean when we say capacity building. And I think capacity building should not just be from the technology side when we're talking about, things like developers, etc. But capacity building should also go to safeguards. Capacity building should also be in scheme building. Like, what are the right schemes? Like something that Rahul just mentioned right now, you need to have capacity to understand that, to understand what is the risk of those two things with one organization or one community. And so I think the conversations around capacity need to expand to beyond technology to just ensure that DPI is both inclusive and safe. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thanks, Rahul.
Yeah, I don't have much more to add. Yeah, I'm just gonna steal exactly what Desiree said. We need a lot more capacity within the tech sector to be able to understand the actual problems that people are facing. And yeah, we need a much better understanding of how do we go about solving some of these problems. We need a much better educational foundation, and again, a community where we can talk about things of this sort. So thanks SFLC for like hosting this very important conversation.
Thanks, Ashish, Rahul, and Desai for joining the discussion. And continuing the series, tomorrow we have a very interesting discussion on unraveling the lessons, challenges, and opportunities, exporting the DPI metrics across the global south. This will be moderated by Angela from the SFLC team, and we have Dr. Dovan Rai from Body and Data, Ardi Ganeshan from Corner Hub, and Mutarika Ture from the Tech Global Institute. Thanks a lot for all of you for joining. Thanks to panelists and all the attendees. Thank you. Looking forward to seeing you all tomorrow.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good day.